Edward Turner had never put his phone down so quickly in his life. One moment he was mindlessly scrolling through social media, the blue light casting shadows across his face in the dim coffee shop. And the next moment, Lewis Kim was standing beside his table with that nervous energy that made Edward's chest tighten in ways he couldn't quite explain. The phone clattered against the wooden surface as Edward looked up, his heart doing something complicated and unfamiliar. Lewis had been watching Edward for weeks now, studying the way he held his coffee cup with both hands, like he was trying to warm himself from the inside out, memorizing the exact shade of concentration that crossed his features when he read, cataloging every small gesture like they were precious artifacts. And now, standing here with his own hands trembling slightly around his laptop bag, Lewis felt like he was about to cross a bridge that would change everything. Edward smiled, that easy, warm smile that had been haunting Lewis's dreams for months, and gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Come sit," Edward said, his voice softer than usual. And Lewis felt something electric shoot through his entire nervous system. This was the moment everything shifted. But to understand how they arrived at this precipice, how two friends found themselves balanced on the edge of something that felt too big and too terrifying and too perfect to name, we need to go back to where it all began. 3 months earlier, Lewis Kim had been convinced he had his life figured out. 26 years old, working as a graphic designer for a small but successful marketing firm downtown, living in a decent apartment in the Arts District with his best friend, Gary King. He had dated women throughout college and his early 20s, had even been in what he thought was love with Lisa Evans for nearly 2 years. But something had always felt like it was missing, like he was performing a role rather than living his authentic life. The first time Lewis saw Edward Turner, he was sitting in the exact same coffee shop, Grind Coffee on Fifth Street, hunched over a thick psychology textbook with highlighter marks covering nearly every page. Edward's dark hair kept falling into his eyes as he read, and he had this habit of pushing it back with his fingers that made Lewis's stomach do something strange and fluttery. Lewis had ordered his usual medium roast with oat milk and found himself lingering by the pickup counter, stealing glances at the stranger who seemed completely absorbed in his studies. Edward was 24, a graduate student in clinical psychology at the local university, and he had the kind of focused intensity that drew people to him without him even realizing it. He spent most afternoons at Grind Coffee because his apartment was too quiet and the library too sterile, and he needed the gentle buzz of human activity to help him concentrate. He had noticed Louis that first day too, had felt an odd pull of curiosity about the guy with the messenger bag covered in art supply store stickers who kept looking in his direction. It took 3 weeks of these parallel coffee shop visits before they actually spoke to each other. Lewis had been struggling with a particularly difficult client project, something involving a rebranding for a local nonprofit, and his frustrated sighs had apparently been loud enough to carry across the small space. Edward had looked up from his textbook, caught Lewis's eye, and offered a sympathetic smile. "Whoa, rough day?" Edward had said, and Lewis had felt something warm unfurl in his chest at the genuine concern in the stranger's voice. "You could say that," Lewis had replied, gesturing helplessly at his laptop screen. "I'm trying to make a logo for an animal rescue organization, and everything I create looks either too corporate or too childish. There's no middle ground." Edward had closed his textbook, marking his place carefully with a worn leather bookmark, and asked if he could take a look. This simple question had opened a door that neither of them could close. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. That first conversation had lasted 2 hours. Edward had offered thoughtful suggestions about the logo design, drawing on his psychology background to talk about color theory and emotional response, while Lewis had found himself sharing more about his creative process than he usually did with anyone. There was something about Edward's way of listening, the way he leaned forward slightly and asked follow-up questions that showed he was genuinely interested, that made Lewis feel seen in a way that was both comfortable and slightly terrifying. "You know," Edward had said, studying Louis's latest sketch, "the research shows that people form emotional connections to brands within milliseconds of seeing them. What you're trying to capture isn't just what the organization does, but how it makes people feel." "That's exactly what I've been struggling with," Lewis had replied, his eyes lighting up with understanding. I keep focusing on the technical aspects, but I haven't been thinking about the emotional impact. Edward had smiled, that warm expression that would become so familiar to Lewis over the coming months. Sometimes an outside perspective helps. I do the same thing with my research, getting so caught up in the methodology that I forget about the human element. They had exchanged numbers that day, ostensibly so Edward could see the final version of the logo once Lewis finished it. But the text messages that followed had nothing to do with graphic design and everything to do with the strange magnetic pull they both felt toward each other. Edward would send Lewis pictures of interesting cloud formations he saw on his walks to campus, accompanied by messages about how they reminded him of some abstract art piece he had seen in a museum. Lewis would respond with photos of street art he discovered during his lunch breaks, along with stories about the artists he recognized and the techniques they used. These small exchanges became the highlight of both their days, though neither of them was quite ready to admit it yet. The shift from casual acquaintances to something deeper happened gradually, then all at once. Louis started timing his coffee shop visits to coincide with Edward's study sessions. Edward began choosing tables with extra chairs, unconsciously hoping Louis would join him. They fell into a routine of shared afternoon conversations, discussing everything from Edward's psychology coursework to Louis's latest design projects, to their opinions on the coffee shop's rotating selection of local pastries. I never understood why people came to coffee shops to work, Edward confessed one afternoon as they shared a blueberry scone. I always thought it would be too distracting, but there's something about the ambient noise that actually helps me focus. It's like having company without the pressure of conversation, Louis agreed, watching Edward break off another piece of the scone with careful precision. Sometimes when I'm working alone in my apartment, the silence gets too heavy. Here I feel connected to the world without having to engage with it directly. Gary King, Louis' roommate, was the first to notice the change. Louis had always been social, but there was something different about the way he talked about Edward, a particular softness in his voice that Gary had never heard before. When Louis started mentioning Edward in nearly every conversation, Gary raised an eyebrow and asked if there was something Louis wanted to tell him. He's just a friend, Louis had insisted. But even as he said it, he felt the words ring hollow. The truth was more complicated than that, more layered with feelings he didn't have names for yet. Just a friend who you text constantly and meet up with every single day? Gary had pressed, settling onto their couch with a knowing look. Louis, I've been your roommate for 3 years. I've never seen you this invested in a friendship before. It's not like that, Louis had protested, though his cheeks had flushed in a way that contradicted his words. We just have a lot in common. He's easy to talk to. Edward was dealing with his own confusion. He had always been attracted to women, had dated several during his undergraduate years, though none of those relationships had felt particularly meaningful or lasting. But there was something about Louis that made him question assumptions he had never thought to examine. The way Louis's face lit up when he talked about a project he was passionate about, the careful attention he paid when Edward explained some psychological concept he was studying, the easy way conversation flowed between them, it all felt different from anything Edward had experienced before. Mary Ramirez, Edward's study partner in his advanced therapy techniques class, noticed the change too. Edward had always been focused and driven, but lately he seemed distracted, checking his phone more frequently and smiling at messages in a way that seemed almost secretive. You've been different lately, Mary said one afternoon as they reviewed case studies in the university library. More relaxed, maybe, or happier. What's going on? Edward had felt heat rise in his cheeks, a reaction that surprised him with its intensity. Nothing specific, he had said. Just been making some new friends. But Mary was training to be a therapist, and she had good instincts about these things. She gave Edward a knowing look and said, sometimes the most important relationships start as friendships. The moment everything changed happened on a Thursday evening in late October. Louis had been having a particularly stressful week at work, dealing with a client who kept requesting revision after revision on a project that should have been straightforward. He had texted Edward earlier that day, a message that was more vulnerable than his usual casual observations about art or coffee. Having one of those days where I question whether I'm actually good at my job, Louis had written. Sorry for the negativity, just needed to tell someone who might understand. Edward had responded immediately. Want to talk about it? I'm at Grind Coffee until they close if you want company. When Lewis arrived at the coffee shop, he found Edward at their usual table. But instead of textbooks, Edward had spread out what looked like the art supplies. Colored pencils, a sketch pad, and several sheets of paper covered in Edward's careful handwriting. I thought you might need a creative distraction, Edward said, looking slightly embarrassed. I know I'm not an artist, but I remembered you saying that sometimes drawing helps you process stress. Lewis felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that spread outward from his heart and made his hands shake slightly as he sat down. No one had ever done something like this for him before, had never paid such careful attention to his needs and preferences. Edward, Lewis said softly, his voice catching slightly on the name. This is, no one has ever, it's not a big deal, Edward said quickly, though the way he was fidgeting with his pen suggested it was very much a big deal to him, Mom. I just thought, maybe if you had something to do with your hands while we talked. They spent the next 3 hours drawing together, Edward attempting sketches of the other coffee shop patrons, while Lewis created abstract designs that seemed to flow directly from his emotions onto the paper. They talked about stress and creativity and the pressure to constantly prove yourself in a competitive field. Edward shared stories about his own struggles with imposter syndrome in graduate school, while Lewis opened up about his fears that he was wasting his artistic talents on commercial design work. Sometimes I wonder if I'm just a sellout, Lewis confessed as he shaded in another section of his abstract piece. I went to art school dreaming of gallery shows and meaningful work, and now I spend my days making logos for companies that probably don't even care about good design. But you do care, Edward pointed out, looking up from his own sketch. And that makes a difference. The animal rescue logo you showed me last month, that wasn't just commercial work. That was art with purpose. As the coffee shop prepared to close around them, Lewis realized that the knot of anxiety that had been sitting in his stomach all week had completely dissolved. He felt lighter, more centered, more like himself than he had in months. Thank you, Lewis said as they packed up their things. I mean it. This was exactly what I needed. Edward smiled, but there was something different about his expression, something softer and more uncertain than usual. I'm glad, he said. I like seeing you happy. The way Edward said it, the particular tone of his voice, and the way his eyes lingered on Lewis's face, made something electric pass between them. For a moment, the air felt charged with possibility, with questions neither of them was quite ready to ask. They walked out of the coffee shop together, their shoulders brushing occasionally as they navigated the crowded sidewalk. When they reached the corner where they usually parted ways, Edward heading toward campus and Louis toward the bus stop, they both hesitated. Same time tomorrow, Edward asked, but it sounded more like a statement than a question. Definitely, Louis replied, and they stood there for another moment, as if neither wanted to be the first to leave. That night, Lewis lay awake staring at the ceiling of his bedroom, replaying every moment of the evening. The way Edward had thought to bring art supplies, the way their hands had brushed when they reached for the same colored pencil, the way Edward had looked at him when he said he liked seeing Lewis happy. There was something building between them, something that felt bigger than friendship, but smaller than he dared to hope for. Edward was having similar thoughts in his own apartment, a small studio near the university that he had decorated with plants and books and soft lighting that made everything feel warm and inviting. He kept thinking about the expression on Lewis's face when he had seen the art supplies, the genuine surprise and gratitude that had made Edward's heart race in a way that felt both wonderful and terrifying. He had never felt this way about a male friend before, had never experienced this particular combination of emotional intimacy and physical awareness. When Lewis smiled, Edward felt it in his entire body. When Lewis talked about something he was passionate about, Edward found himself watching the movements of Lewis's hands, the way his eyes lit up, the subtle changes in his voice. It was attraction, Edward realized with a start. He was attracted to Lewis Kim in a way that went far beyond friendship. This realization kept Edward awake most of the night, staring at the shadows the streetlight cast on his wall and trying to make sense of feelings he had never experienced before. He had always assumed he was straight, had never questioned his sexuality or considered the possibility that he might be interested in men. But the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. The next afternoon, Edward arrived at Grind Coffee earlier than usual, claiming a table by the window and spreading out his psychology textbooks in a way that looked casual but was actually carefully calculated to save the best seat for Lewis. He found himself checking the door every few minutes, his heart jumping slightly each time someone entered. When Lewis finally walked in, Edward felt that familiar flutter of excitement and nervousness that had become associated with these daily meetings. But there was something different about Lewis today, a particular energy that seemed more intense than usual. Lewis ordered his coffee and joined Edward at the table, but instead of immediately launching into their usual easy conversation, he seemed hesitant, almost nervous. "I've been thinking about yesterday," Lewis said, his fingers wrapped around his coffee cup like he needed something to hold on to. "About what you did for me, the art supplies and everything." Edward felt heat rise in his cheeks. "It wasn't a big deal," he said, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. "It was to me," Lewis replied, and there was something in his voice that made Edward look up from his textbook and give Lewis his full attention. "I keep thinking about how you knew exactly what I needed, even when I didn't know it myself. How you pay attention to things that matter to me." Edward felt his heart start to beat faster, sensing that this conversation was heading somewhere significant, but not sure exactly where. "I care about you," Edward said simply, and the words hung in the air between them with more weight than either had expected. Lewis was quiet for a moment, studying Edward's face like he was trying to memorize every detail. "I care about you too," he said finally. "More than I probably should." "What does that mean?" Edward asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Lewis took a deep breath, as if he was preparing to jump off a cliff. "I think it means I'm not as straight as I always thought I was," he said. "I am, and I think it means I've been falling for my best friend without even realizing it." The words hit Edward like electricity, making his entire body feel suddenly alive and terrified at the same time. He had been hoping for this moment and dreading it in equal measure, wanting Lewis to feel the same way, but afraid of what it would mean for both of them. "Lewis," Edward said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know it's complicated," Lewis continued, his words coming faster now, as if he needed to get them all out before he lost his nerve. "I know it changes everything between us, but I can't keep pretending I don't feel this way. I can't keep acting like my heart doesn't race every time you smile at me." Edward reached across the table without thinking, covering Lewis's hand with his own. The contact sent a jolt of warmth up his arm, and he saw Lewis's eyes widen slightly at the touch. "You're not the only one who's been confused," Edward said. "I've never felt this way about a guy before. Never even considered the possibility. But with you, it's like everything I thought I knew about myself just went out the window." They sat there for a moment, hands touching across the small table, both of them breathing a little faster than usual as the magnitude of what they had just admitted settled between them. "What do we do now?" Lewis asked, and Edward could hear the vulnerability in his voice. "I don't know," Edward replied honestly, "but I know I don't want to pretend this isn't happening." Lewis nodded, his thumb brushing across Edward's knuckles in a gesture that felt both innocent and incredibly intimate. "Me neither," he said. The coffee shop continued to buzz with activity around them, other customers coming and going, the baristas calling out drink orders, the familiar sounds of daily life carrying on as if nothing had changed. But for Edward and Louis, sitting at their small table by the window with their hands intertwined, everything had shifted. They talked for another hour, their conversation meandering through territory they had never explored before. Edward shared his confusion about his sexuality, his fear that he was too old to be having these realizations about himself. Lewis talked about his past relationships with women, how they had always felt like he was playing a role rather than being authentic. "I keep thinking about Lisa," Lewis said, referring to his ex-girlfriend. "She was wonderful and I cared about her, but something was always missing. I thought it was just that we weren't compatible, but now I'm wondering if the missing piece was that I was trying to force myself into something that didn't fit." Edward nodded, understanding exactly what Lewis meant. "I dated this woman, Jennifer, for almost a year in undergrad," he said. "She was smart and funny and beautiful, and I kept waiting to feel the kind of connection that everyone talks about. The butterflies, the can't stop thinking about them feeling. I thought maybe I just wasn't a romantic person. But you feel that now, Lewis said, and it wasn't really a question. Edward's heart skipped. Yeah, he said, I feel that now. As the afternoon wore on, they found themselves moving closer together, their chairs angled toward each other in a way that created a sense of intimacy despite the public setting. Edward found himself noticing details about Lewis that he had never allowed himself to focus on before. The way Lewis's eyes crinkled slightly when he smiled, the graceful movement of his hands when he talked, the way his hair caught the light streaming through the coffee shop window. Lewis was doing his own cataloging, cataloging, memorizing the sound of Edward's laugh, the way he bit his lower lip when he was thinking, the particular shade of brown his eyes turned in the afternoon sunlight. Everything felt heightened, more vivid, like someone had turned up the saturation on the world. Can I tell you something? Lewis said, as they prepared to leave, his voice soft and uncertain. Anything, Edward replied. I've been dreaming about you, Lewis admitted, his cheeks flushing pink. Not just recently, but for weeks now. And when I wake up, I feel guilty because I didn't think I was supposed to have those kinds of dreams about a male friend. Edward's breath caught in his throat. What kind of dreams? He asked, though his voice came out rougher than he intended. Dreams where we're together, Lewis said simply. Where I can touch you and kiss you and tell you how I feel without being afraid. The honesty in Lewis's voice, the vulnerability of the admission made Edward feel brave in a way he had never experienced before. I've been having those dreams too, he confessed. And I've been waking up disappointed that they weren't real. When they finally left the coffee shop that evening, they walked more slowly than usual, neither wanting the day to end. At their usual parting corner, they stopped and faced each other, the weight of their earlier conversation still hanging between them. This feels scary, Lewis admitted, looking down at his shoes. Edward stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in Lewis's eyes. Terrifying, he agreed, but also right. Lewis looked up, meeting Edward's gaze, and for a moment they just stood there on the busy sidewalk, the rest of the world fading away around them. Can I hug you? Edward asked, his voice soft. Lewis nodded, and Edward stepped forward, wrapping his arms around Lewis in an embrace that felt different from any hug they had shared before. Lewis melted into the contact, his face pressed against Edward's shoulder, breathing in the scent of Edward's cologne mixed with coffee and something that was uniquely him. They held each other for longer than friends typically would, both of them reluctant to let go. When they finally separated, there was a new understanding between them, an acknowledgement that they had crossed a line into territory that was both thrilling and uncertain. I'll see you tomorrow, Edward said, his hand lingering on Louis's arm. Tomorrow, Louis agreed, and they stood there for another moment before finally, reluctantly, heading in opposite directions. That night, both of them lay awake thinking about the day, about the weight of Edward's hand on Lewis's arm, about the way Lewis had fit perfectly against Edward's chest during their hug, about the implications of everything they had said and felt. Lewis texted Edward around midnight. Thank you for today, for listening and understanding and not making me feel crazy. Edward responded almost immediately. Thank you for being brave enough to say what we were both thinking. Over the next few days, their relationship continued to evolve in small, significant ways. Their text messages became more frequent and more personal. Their coffee shop conversations grew deeper, more intimate, as they explored their feelings for each other and what it might mean for their futures. Edward started researching sexuality and identity, reading articles about people who discovered they were attracted to the same gender later in life. He learned about the concept of compulsory heterosexuality, the idea that society's default assumptions about sexuality could cause people to suppress or ignore their true feelings. It helped him understand his own experience, the way he had always felt like something was missing from his relationships with women. Lewis talked to Gary about his confusion, though he didn't mention Edward by name initially. Gary, who had always been supportive and open-minded, listened without judgment and offered reassurance that there was no timeline for self-discovery. You don't have to have everything figured out right now, Gary said as they sat in their living room, sharing a pizza and watching Netflix. Sexuality can be fluid. You're allowed to explore and question and change your mind. But what if I'm just confused? Lewis asked, picking at the cheese on his pizza slice. What if this is just some kind of phase or midlife crisis? Gary laughed gently. No, first of all, you're 26, not 46. Second of all, even if it is a phase, so what? You're allowed to explore your feelings without having to commit to a label for the rest of your life. The conversation with Gary gave Lewis permission to stop putting pressure on himself to understand everything immediately. He began to simply allow himself to feel what he was feeling for Edward without needing to label it or fit it into a predetermined category. Meanwhile, Edward was having his own revelations. During a study session with Mary Ramirez, she asked him about the friend he had mentioned, the one who seemed to be making him so happy. "Tell me about him," Mary said, looking up from her notes on cognitive behavioral therapy techniques. Edward felt his cheeks warm, but something about Mary's open, non-judgmental expression made him want to share. "His name is Lewis," Edward said. "He's an artist, a graphic designer. He's incredibly talented and thoughtful and funny. He has this way of seeing the world that's completely different from mine, but somehow we just understand each other." Mary smiled. "You light up when you talk about him," she observed. "How long have you been together?" "We're not together," Edward said quickly. "We're just friends. I mean, we're figuring things out." Mary raised an eyebrow. "Figuring things out how?" Edward sighed, running his hands through his hair. "I think I might be attracted to him," he admitted. "Actually, I know I am, but I've never been attracted to a man before, so I'm not sure what that means or what I should do about it." Mary nodded thoughtfully. "Have you talked to him about it?" "Some," Edward said. "He's having similar feelings, I think, but we're both scared of ruining our friendship." "Edward," Mary said gently, "sometimes the best romantic relationships start as friendships. You already have a foundation of trust and understanding. That's not something to be afraid of, it's something to build on." Her words stayed with Edward for the rest of the week, giving him a new perspective on his situation with Lewis. Instead of focusing on his fear and confusion, he began to think about the possibilities, about what it might be like to explore these feelings with someone he already cared about so deeply. The next Thursday, exactly 1 week after their first honest conversation about their feelings, Edward arrived at Grind Coffee with a sense of determination. He had been thinking all week about what Mary had said, about the foundation of friendship they had built, about the way Lewis made him feel more like himself than anyone else ever had. Lewis arrived a few minutes after Edward, and there was something different about his energy too, a sense of purpose that matched Edward's own mood. "I've been thinking," Lewis said as he sat down, not bothering with his usual small talk about the weather or the coffee shop's music selection. "Me too," Edward replied. "You first." Lewis took a deep breath. "I think I've been overthinking this whole thing," he said, "trying to understand and categorize and make sense of feelings that maybe don't need to be analyzed to death." Edward nodded, encouraging Lewis to continue. "The truth is," Lewis said, "I'm attracted to you. I have feelings for you that go way beyond friendship. And I think I've been so focused on what that means for my identity or my understanding of myself that I've been missing the bigger point, which is," Edward prompted, though he thought he knew where Louis was going, "which is that I care about you more than I've ever cared about anyone," Louis said. "And I think we could be really good together if we're brave enough to try." Edward felt his heart rate accelerate, a combination of excitement and nervousness that made his hands shake slightly. "I've been thinking the same thing," he said. "I've been so worried about labels and definitions that I forgot the most important part." "What's that?" Lewis asked. "That I'm falling in love with you," Edward said, the words coming out in a rush before he could second-guess himself. Lewis's face broke into a smile that was so bright and genuine that Edward felt something warm and expansive bloom in his chest. "I'm falling in love with you too," Louise said, and hearing the words out loud made everything feel suddenly, perfectly real. They sat there grinning at each other across the small table, both of them feeling giddy with the relief of finally saying what they had been thinking for weeks. "So what now?" Edward asked. "Now I think we stop overthinking and start exploring," Lewis said. "We take it one day at a time and see what happens." Edward reached across the table and took Lewis's hand, intertwining their fingers in a gesture that felt both familiar and thrillingly new. "I'd like that," Edward said. They spent the rest of the afternoon talking about practical things, about how they wanted to navigate this new aspect of their relationship, about their hopes and fears and expectations. Edward shared his concerns about coming out to his family and his psychology program colleagues. Lewis talked about his worries regarding how this might affect his friendship with Gary and his professional relationships. My parents are pretty liberal, Edward said, absently tracing patterns on Louis's palm with his finger. But I've never brought home a boyfriend before. I'm not sure how they'll react to me suddenly being in a same-sex relationship. Have you ever talked to them about sexuality or LGBTQ plus issues? Louis asked. Edward thought for a moment. My mom has always been supportive of marriage equality and things like that, and they've never made any homophobic comments. But there's a difference between supporting other people's relationships and having your own child come out to you. Lewis nodded, understanding the distinction. I used to always, oh, Gary's been my best friend since college, and he's always been incredibly open-minded. But I'm still nervous about telling him that everything he thought he knew about my dating life was apparently wrong. But underneath all the practical considerations was a current of excitement and joy that neither of them could suppress. They had found something rare and precious, a connection that felt both surprising and inevitable. As the coffee shop began to empty out in the early evening, Edward suggested they continue their conversations somewhere more private. They walked to Edward's apartment, their hands brushing occasionally as they navigated the sidewalks, each contact sending small jolts of electricity through both of them. Edward's apartment was exactly what Lewis had imagined it would be. Warm and cozy, filled with books and plants and soft lighting that made everything feel intimate and welcoming. Psychology textbooks were stacked on every available surface, mixed with novels and poetry collections that revealed a softer side of Edward's personality. Plants hung from the ceiling and crowded the windowsills, creating a jungle-like atmosphere that felt alive and nurturing. They settled on Edward's couch, sitting closer together than they ever had before, their knees touching as they continued their conversation. I keep waiting for this to feel weird or wrong, Lewis admitted as they shared a bottle of wine Edward had opened. But it just feels right. Edward nodded, his hand resting on Lewis's knee in a gesture that felt natural and comfortable. I know what you mean, he said. I keep thinking I should be more confused or conflicted, but mostly I just feel happy. As the evening progressed, they found themselves moving even closer together, their conversation becoming softer and more intimate. Lewis found himself studying the details of Edward's face, the way his eyelashes cast shadows on his cheeks, the curve of his lips when he smiled. Edward was doing his own memorizing, cataloging the way Lewis's voice got slightly deeper when he was being serious, the graceful movements of his hands as he gestured, the way his entire face lit up when he laughed. Can I ask you something? Edward said as they finished their second glass of wine. Anything, Lewis replied. Have you ever kissed a man before? Edward asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lewis shook his head, his heart starting to race. Have you? No, Edward said, but I've been thinking about kissing you. The admission hung in the air between them, charged with possibility and desire, and a hint of nervousness that made everything feel more real and immediate. I've been thinking about it too, Louis said, his voice soft. They looked at each other for a long moment, both of them breathing a little faster than usual, both of them aware that they were approaching another threshold, another moment that would change everything between them. Edward reached up slowly, giving Lewis plenty of time to pull away if he wanted to, and cupped Lewis's face in his hand. Lewis leaned into the touch, his eyes fluttering closed at the gentle contact. Is this okay? Edward asked. More than okay, Lewis whispered. Edward leaned forward slowly, closing the distance between them until their lips were just barely touching. The first contact was soft and tentative, a question more than a statement. But when Lewis responded by pressing closer, the kiss deepened into something more certain and urgent. It was nothing like either of them had expected, and everything they had hoped for. Lewis felt like every nerve ending in his body had suddenly come alive, like he was experiencing sensation for the first time. Edward felt a rightness settle into his bones, a sense of coming home that he had never experienced with anyone else. When they finally separated, both of them were breathing heavily, their foreheads resting together as they processed what had just happened. Wow, Lewis said, his voice slightly shaky. Yeah, Edward agreed, his thumb brushing across Louis's cheekbone. Wow. They kissed again, and then again, each time growing more confident and comfortable with this new form of intimacy between them. Louis ran his fingers through Edward's hair, marveling at its softness. Edward traced the line of Louis's jaw with his fingertips, amazed by how perfectly Louis seemed to fit against him. When they finally broke apart for longer than a few seconds, they were both smiling, their faces flushed and their eyes bright with happiness and desire. That was, Louis started, then trailed off, apparently unable to find adequate words. Perfect, Edward finished. That was perfect. They spent the rest of the evening curled up together on Edward's couch, alternating between soft kisses and quiet conversation, both of them marveling at how natural and right everything felt. Louis told Edward about his first crush on a male classmate in high school, feelings he had dismissed at the time as admiration rather than attraction. Edward shared his memories of feeling different from his male friends in college, the way he had never quite understood their enthusiasm for casual hookups or their detailed discussions of women's bodies. I remember my freshman roommate, Derek, used to talk about women like they were conquests, Edward said, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on Louis's arm. He would describe their bodies in such graphic detail, and I always felt uncomfortable. I thought it was because I was more respectful or something, but now I wonder if it was because I just wasn't interested in the same way he was. I had a similar experience with my college friends, Louis replied. Bombers, they would point out attractive women on campus, and I would agree because that's what I thought I was supposed to do. But I was usually looking at the guys instead and trying to figure out why I found them more interesting. All those times I thought something was wrong with me, Edward said, his voice soft with wonder. I was just looking in the wrong direction. Louis pressed a soft kiss to Edward's temple. We both were, he said. But we found our way here eventually. As the night grew later, they reluctantly acknowledged that Louis should probably head home, though neither of them really wanted the evening to end. They stood by Edward's door, reluctant to separate, stealing one more kiss and then another. I'll see you tomorrow, Edward said, his hands resting on Louis's waist. Tomorrow, Louis agreed, and then, because he couldn't help himself, he added, I love you. Edward's face broke into a smile so bright it could have powered the entire building. I love you too, he said. The next few weeks passed in a blur of happiness and discovery. Edward and Louis continued their daily coffee shop meetings, but now they sat on the same side of the table, their shoulders touching, their hands intertwined. They explored the city together, visiting art galleries and bookstores and parks, everything feeling new and exciting through the lens of their developing relationship. They were careful about public displays of affection, both of them still adjusting to being part of a same-sex couple. But in private, they were affectionate and playful, making up for all the months they had spent suppressing their feelings for each other. I can't believe I used to think I wasn't a physical person, Louis said one evening as they cooked dinner together in Edward's kitchen. Edward's arms wrapped around him from behind as Louis stirred a pot of pasta sauce. I think I just needed the right person to be physical with. Edward pressed a kiss to the back of Louis's neck, breathing in the scent of his shampoo. I know exactly what you mean, he murmured against Louis's skin. I used to think romance was overrated, but now I understand what all the fuss is about. Gary noticed the change in Louis immediately and was thrilled when Louis finally told him about Edward. I knew there was something special about that guy, Gary said, pulling Louis into a tight hug. You've been happier these past few weeks than I've seen you in years. You're not surprised? Louis asked, still feeling nervous about his friend's reaction. Gary laughed. Louis, you've been talking about Edward nonstop for months, and the way your face lights up when you mention him, I would have been more surprised if you told me you were just friends. Mary had a similar reaction when Edward shared his news. She hugged him tightly and told him how proud she was of him for being brave enough to explore his feelings. I have to admit, I was hoping this would happen, Mary confessed as they sat in the university library after their therapy techniques class. You've been different since you met Louis. More confident, happier, more yourself. Edward's family took the news well, too, his parents expressing their support and their eagerness to meet Louis. His mother had cried happy tears over the phone when Edward called to tell them, saying she was just grateful he had found someone who made him so happy. Lewis's family, who lived across the country, were equally accepting when he called to tell them about his new relationship. His sister had laughed and said she had been wondering when he would figure out he was attracted to men, apparently having suspected for years. Everything felt like it was falling into place with an ease that surprised both of them. They had expected more complications, more external resistance, more internal conflict. Instead, they found themselves settling into a rhythm that felt natural and sustainable. 2 months after their first kiss, Lewis brought up the idea of moving in together. They were spending most nights at one apartment or the other anyway, and it seemed silly to maintain two separate leases when they both wanted to be together as much as possible. "What do you think about finding a place together?" Lewis asked one morning as they shared breakfast at Edward's small kitchen table. "I mean, if you think it's too soon, I understand, but—" "Yes," Edward interrupted, his face breaking into a grin. "Absolutely yes. I was actually wondering when you were going to bring it up." Edward loved the idea, and they spent several weekends looking at apartments that could accommodate both of their needs. Edward needed space for his books and his study materials, while Lewis needed good lighting and room for his art supplies and computer equipment. They found a perfect two-bedroom apartment in a converted warehouse building with huge windows and exposed brick walls that satisfied Lewis's artistic sensibilities in built-in bookshelves that made Edward's heart sing. The second bedroom could serve as a shared office space, with Edward's desk on one side and Lewis's drafting table on the other. Moving in together felt like another natural step in their relationship, though it brought its own small adjustments and discoveries. Edward learned that Lewis was a morning person who liked to get up early and make elaborate breakfasts, often involving fresh fruit and homemade pancakes or omelets, with ingredients he had picked up at the farmer's market. Lewis discovered that Edward was a night owl who did his best thinking after 10 in the evening, often staying up until midnight or later working on research papers or reading psychology journals. They developed their own routines and rituals. Edward would make coffee for both of them while Lewis prepared breakfast, their movements around the kitchen becoming a synchronized dance of domestic intimacy. They would eat together at their small kitchen table, reading news articles aloud to each other and discussing their plans for the day. In the evenings, they would cook dinner together, Lewis handling the creative aspects while Edward managed timing and organization. I love watching you cook," Edward said one evening as Lewis experimented with a new pasta recipe, adding ingredients by intuition rather than following any written instructions. You approach it like art, just trusting your instincts." "Cooking is art," Louis replied, offering Edward a taste of the sauce on a wooden spoon. "It's about combining flavors and textures and creating something that makes people happy." Edward tasted the sauce and closed his eyes in appreciation. "This is incredible," he said. "How did you know to add that hint of lemon?" "I didn't know," Lewis said with a smile. "I just felt like it needed something bright to balance the richness of the tomatoes and herbs." Their physical relationship continued to develop at a pace that felt comfortable for both of them. They were both new to being with men, and they took their time exploring what they liked and what felt good. Every touch, every kiss, every moment of intimacy felt like a discovery, a gift they were giving each other. "I never knew it could be like this," Lewis whispered one night as they lay tangled together in their shared bed, moonlight streaming through the windows of their new apartment. "I never knew I could feel so connected to another person." Edward pressed a soft kiss to Lewis' shoulder, tasting the salt of his skin. "I know," he murmured. "Sometimes I feel like we're sharing the same heartbeat." Edward finished his graduate program that spring, successfully defending his thesis on trauma-informed therapy techniques. Lewis was there in the audience, beaming with pride as Edward presented his research to the faculty committee. That evening, they celebrated at their favorite restaurant, toasting Edward's accomplishment and their future together. "I'm so proud of you," Lewis said, raising his glass of wine. "Your research is going to help so many people." "I couldn't have done it without your support," Edward replied, reaching across the table to take Lewis's hand. "You believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself." Louis's career was flourishing too. His work with the animal rescue organization had led to several other nonprofit clients, and he was building a reputation as someone who could create compelling visual identities for organizations with limited budgets but important missions. He found this work much more fulfilling than his previous commercial projects, and Edward's support and encouragement had given him the confidence to pursue the kind of work he was truly passionate about. I got another referral today, Lewis announced, as they prepared dinner together one evening. A domestic violence shelter needs help with their branding and website design. That's wonderful, Edward said, looking up from the vegetables he was chopping. Boys, you're really building something meaningful with your work. It feels good to use my skills for something that matters, Lewis replied. I never thought I could make a living doing the kind of design work I actually care about. 6 months after they moved in together, Edward got a job offer from a community mental health center that specialized in LGBTQ+ issues. It felt like the perfect fit, combining his clinical training with his newfound understanding of his own identity and the challenges faced by people exploring their sexuality. We should celebrate, Lewis said when Edward told him about the job offer. This is exactly what you wanted. They went out for drinks that night, toasting Edward's new position and reflecting on how much their lives had changed since that first conversation in the coffee shop. They were both different people now, more confident in themselves and their relationship, more willing to take risks and pursue what made them happy. I keep thinking about that day when you brought the art supplies to the coffee shop, Lewis said as they walked home from the bar, their arms linked together. Yeah, that was the moment I knew you were special. Edward smiled, remembering his nervousness that day, his uncertainty about whether the gesture would be welcomed or awkward. I was so worried you'd think it was weird, he said. It was the most thoughtful thing anyone had ever done for me, Lewis replied. That's when I started falling in love with you, even though I didn't understand what was happening at the time. They stopped walking, and Edward turned to face Lewis, cupping his face in his hands the way he had that first night they kissed. I'm so glad we found each other, Edward said. I can't imagine my life without you in it. Lewis leaned into Edward's touch, still amazed by how safe and loved he felt in Edward's arms. Me too, he said. I feel like I spent the first 26 years of my life waiting for you without even knowing it. They kissed there on the sidewalk, not caring who might see them, both of them filled with gratitude for the courage they had found to explore their feelings and build something beautiful together. A year after they first admitted their feelings for each other, Edward and Lewis were back at Grind Coffee, sitting at the same table where everything had started. They came here less frequently now, their lives full of work and friends and shared adventures, but they still returned occasionally, drawn by nostalgia and the significance of this place in their love story. Edward was reading a book about couples therapy techniques, preparing for a new training program at work, while Lewis sketched ideas for a logo design for a local LGBTQ+ youth center. They worked in comfortable silence, occasionally sharing interesting passages or asking for opinions on design choices. Listen to this, Edward said, reading from his textbook. The most successful long-term relationships are built on a foundation of friendship, mutual respect, and shared values. Partners who genuinely like each other as people, not just as romantic interests, are more likely to weather the inevitable challenges of life together. Lewis looked up from his sketch pad, smiling. Sounds familiar, he said. We definitely got the friendship part right first. I think that's why this feels so solid, Edward replied, reaching across the table to squeeze Lewis's hand. We didn't just fall in love with each other. We fell in love with each other's minds and personalities and ways of seeing the world. A young man at a nearby table was struggling with what looked like a difficult homework assignment, sighing in frustration as he erased and rewrote the same paragraph multiple times. Edward and Lewis exchanged a look, both of them remembering their own stressful afternoons in this same space. Should we? Lewis asked quietly, gesturing toward the struggling student. Edward smiled and nodded. They approached the young man's table together, Edward introducing himself and asking if he could offer any help with what appeared to be a psychology assignment. The student, whose name was Dennis Campbell, looked up gratefully and explained that he was working on a paper about identity development for his undergraduate psychology course. He was particularly struggling with the section about sexual identity and self-discovery. That's actually something we know quite a bit about, Lewis said, settling into the chair beside Dennis, while Edward pulled up another seat. They spent the next hour talking with Dennis about identity formation, sharing their own experiences of questioning and self-discovery without being overly personal or inappropriate. Edward offered academic resources and theoretical frameworks, while Lewis talked about the practical aspects of coming out and finding community. The thing about identity, Edward explained, is that it's not always linear or predictable. People can discover new things about themselves at any age, and that's completely normal and healthy. I think I might be gay, Dennis admitted quietly, looking around nervously as if someone might overhear. But I've dated women before, and I cared about them. So maybe I'm just confused? Sexuality can be fluid, Lewis said gently. Oh, and there's no timeline for figuring out who you are. I dated women for years before I realized I was attracted to men. That doesn't make my previous relationships invalid. It just means I was learning about myself. Dennis listened intently, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions. By the end of their conversation, he had a clear outline for his paper, and more importantly, seemed to have gained some confidence about his own journey of self-exploration. Thank you so much, Dennis said as they prepared to leave. I've been struggling with this topic because it feels so personal, but talking to you both helped me realize that's actually what makes it important. Edward and Lewis walked home that evening feeling energized by their impromptu mentoring session. It reminded them of how far they had come in their own journey and how much they had learned about themselves and each other. I think we should do more of that, Lewis said as they prepared dinner together in their kitchen. Helping other people who are going through what we went through. Edward nodded enthusiastically. Maybe we could volunteer with that LGBTQ plus youth center you're designing for, he suggested. I could offer counseling support, and you could do art therapy workshops. The idea excited both of them, and they spent the evening researching volunteer opportunities and discussing how they might use their skills and experience to support other people navigating questions about sexuality and identity. 2 years into their relationship, Edward and Lewis had settled into a life together that felt both stable and adventurous. They had their routines and their shared spaces, but they also continued to surprise each other and grow both individually and as a couple. Edward had been promoted to a supervisory role at the Community Mental Health Center, where he was developing new programs for LGBTQ plus clients and training other therapists in culturally competent care. His work was challenging and fulfilling, and he often came home with stories about clients who were making progress or colleagues who were expanding their understanding of identity and sexuality. We had a breakthrough with one of my clients today, Edward told Lewis one evening as they walked through their neighborhood after dinner. A teenager who's been struggling with coming out to his parents. He finally felt ready to have that conversation, and we spent the whole session role-playing different scenarios. That must feel amazing, Lewis replied, squeezing Edward's hand. And knowing that you're helping people through such a difficult process? It does, Edward said, especially because I remember how scary it was for us, and we had each other for support. Some of these kids are doing it completely alone. Lewis had started his own design consultancy, specializing in branding and marketing for nonprofit organizations and small businesses owned by members of marginalized communities. His client base was growing steadily, and he was able to choose projects that aligned with his values while still making a comfortable living. I got a call today from a woman who's starting a support group for parents of LGBTQ plus kids, Lewis said as they paused to admire a particularly beautiful mural on the side of a local coffee shop. She needs help with everything from logo design to website development to promotional materials. That sounds perfect for you, Edward said. You could probably do that work in your sleep at this point. The best part is that she found me through word of mouth, Lewis continued. Listen, one of my other nonprofit clients recommended me. It feels good to know that I'm building a reputation in the community. They had also become more involved in their local LGBTQ plus community, volunteering regularly at the youth center, and participating in advocacy work around mental health and arts education. Their relationship had given them both a sense of belonging and purpose that extended beyond just their connection to each other. One evening in late fall, as they were walking through their neighborhood after dinner at a new restaurant they had been wanting to try, Lewis brought up a topic they had been dancing around for several months. I've been thinking about marriage, he said, his voice casual, but his heart racing slightly as he said the words. Edward stopped walking, turning to look at Lewis with surprise and excitement. Really? He asked. Lewis nodded, suddenly feeling nervous despite the fact that they had been together for 2 years and living together for over a year. I know it's a big step, he said, and I know we're still relatively new to all of this, but I can't imagine wanting to spend my life with anyone else. Edward felt a warm glow spread through his chest, the same feeling he had experienced that first day when Lewis had admitted his feelings in the coffee shop. I've been thinking about it too, he said. Actually, I've been thinking about it for months. They stood there on the sidewalk, grinning at each other like teenagers, both of them amazed by how perfectly their thoughts had aligned once again. So, Lewis said, his voice slightly shaky with excitement and nerves. Are we talking about getting engaged? I think we are, Edward replied, reaching for Lewis's hands. I think we're talking about spending the rest of our lives together. They kissed right there on the street corner, not caring about the other pedestrians or the traffic or anything else except the joy of this moment and the promise of their future together. I want to do this right, Edward said when they finally broke apart. I want to plan something special, something that shows you how much you mean to me. Lewis smiled, his eyes bright with happy tears. You don't need to do anything elaborate, he said. Just being with you is special enough. But Edward was already making plans, thinking about all the ways he could show Lewis how much their relationship meant to him, how grateful he was for the courage they had both found to explore their feelings and build something beautiful together. 6 months later, on a warm Saturday afternoon in May, Edward Turner and Lewis Kim were married in a small ceremony in the garden behind the community center, where they had met Dennis Campbell and started their volunteer work. Their families and closest friends gathered to witness their vows, which they had written themselves and which brought tears to nearly everyone's eyes. Edward promised to continue growing and learning alongside Lewis, to support his artistic dreams and share in his creative adventures. You taught me that love isn't about finding someone who fits into your existing life, Edward said, his voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm him. It's about finding someone who makes you want to build a completely new life together. Lewis promised to love Edward's analytical mind and gentle heart, to be his partner in both the quiet moments and the exciting challenges that lay ahead. Before I met you, I thought I knew who I was, Lewis said, his eyes never leaving Edward's face. But you showed me that the most important discoveries happen when we're brave enough to question our assumptions and open our hearts to unexpected possibilities. Gary King served as Lewis's best man, while Mary Ramirez stood up for Edward. Dennis Campbell, who had become a friend and mentee over the past year, read a poem he had written about the courage it takes to live authentically. Love is not just about finding someone who accepts you as you are, Dennis read, his young voice carrying across the garden. It's about finding someone who inspires you to become the person you never knew you could be. After the ceremony, as they danced to their first song as a married couple, Edward and Lewis reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From that first day in Grind Coffee, when Edward had put down his phone and really seen Lewis for the first time, to the celebration of their commitment, surrounded by people who loved and supported them, their story felt like proof that the most beautiful love stories often begin with friendship and grow through courage and honesty. I love you, Lewis whispered in Edward's ear as they swayed together on the small dance floor, surrounded by the soft glow of string lights and the laughter of their friends and family. I love you too, Edward replied, holding his husband close and marveling at how perfectly Lewis fit in his arms, how right everything felt when they were together. As the evening wound down and their guests began to head home, Edward and Lewis stood together in the garden where they had promised to love each other for the rest of their lives. The string lights twinkled overhead, and the air was warm and sweet with the scent of blooming flowers. Are you ready for this? Louis asked, gesturing toward their future, toward all the adventures and challenges and quiet moments that awaited them. Edward smiled, the same bright, genuine smile that had made Lewis's heart race in that coffee shop 2.5 years earlier. With you, he said, I'm ready for anything. They walked home together as husband and husband, their hands intertwined, their hearts full of love and hope and gratitude for the unexpected path that had led them to each other. And if you had asked either of them in that moment, they would have told you that sometimes the most important conversations begin when Someone puts down their phone and decides to really listen to the person sitting across from them. The next morning, they woke up in their shared bed as married men, sunlight streaming through the windows of the apartment they had made into a home together. Edward made coffee while Louis prepared breakfast, their movements around the kitchen as synchronized and natural as they had been for months, but with an added layer of significance now that they had made their commitment official. "So," Louis said as they sat at their kitchen table, sharing the Sunday newspaper and planning their day, "how does it feel to be married?" Edward considered the question, sipping his coffee and looking across the table at his husband. "It feels exactly the same and completely different," he said finally. "Like we've been married in our hearts for a long time, but now the whole world knows it too." Louis nodded, understanding exactly what Edward meant. Their relationship hadn't changed overnight, but there was something profound about having made their commitment public, about having their families and friends witness their promises to each other. "I keep thinking about Dennis's poem," Louis said, "about becoming the person you never knew you could be. I feel like that's what happened to both of us. We discovered parts of ourselves we didn't even know existed," Edward agreed. "And we did it together, which makes it even more meaningful." They spent the morning reading and talking and planning their future, discussing everything from career goals to travel dreams to the possibility of starting a family someday. Everything felt possible now, every dream within reach as long as they had each other. And in that moment, sitting in their sunny kitchen with the newspaper spread between them and their whole lives ahead of them, Edward Turner and Louis Kim knew that they had found something rare and precious, a love that had grown from friendship, deepened through honesty, and strengthened through the courage to embrace who they really were, both individually and together.